Welcome to the Christmas Banquet by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Christmas Banquet is a short story written by Nathaniel Hawthorne sometime around the year 1837. It was at first a notebook entry, but it was revised for publication in 1844, where it appeared in the Democratic Review. 2 years later, the Christmas Banquet found a permanent home in Hawthorne's collection of tales entitled Mosses from an Old Manse, which was published in 1846. We have here on screen the Christmas Banquet, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is part of a larger group, so his name isn't mentioned here. It's mentioned at the beginning of the text. Here we have information from the publisher, which wouldn't have been published originally, and it was originally from Allegories of the Heart. Then we have the text itself, and we can see that the opening passage is separated from text that is to follow, which means that it's meant to be an introductory passage. We see that it begins with someone speaking because the words are in quotes, and we see that the person speaking is named Roderick. So what Roderick is saying, he says, I have here attempted, and there are stage actions, which I call them stage action, even though they're not written for the stage. It's like activity that we're supposed to imagine in our minds of what he is doing while he is speaking. So I call them stage actions, as if it was going to be performed in a drama on stage. And we see that he is unfolding a few sheets of manuscript. So what we're supposed to glean from this, just in these first set of words, is that he's speaking to someone. He's unfolding a few sheets of manuscripts, and he says that I have here attempted. We have to judge for ourselves that because he's not saying I have written or I am writing, he is merely saying I have attempted. So we don't know what it is that he's attempting, but because he is unfolding a few sheets of manuscript, we as readers are supposed to glean that Roderick has attempted to write something. We don't know what it is that he's writing yet, but we do know that he's sitting with someone named Rosina, and he's sitting with a sculptor, and they are in the summer house. The first line reads, I have here attempted, said Roderick, unfolding a few sheets of manuscript, as he sat with Rosina and the sculptor in the summer house. And then he repeats himself, following a dash. I have attempted to seize hold of a personage who glides past me. So that's the first part of a larger sentence, and he's using the word personage, which is an antiquated way of saying person. So we know we're dealing with something of a historical text when we see a word like personage. So he says, I have here attempted to seize hold of a personage who glides past me occasionally in my walk through life. So this is metaphorical language, and we interpret this as best as we possibly can to restate the phrase in our minds as we're reading. I have attempted to seize hold. So what he's saying is, I have attempted to write about someone that he sees in his daily life, which is metaphorical too, It doesn't even say daily. So you can see how the mind is quick to think of things that don't actually combine with the text. It's in my walk through life, and it's occasionally, it's not daily. So you can see how my mind jumped to the idea of daily life, when in fact he's saying that from time to time he recognizes someone who seems out of the ordinary, which would explain why he's trying to write about him. So that's what close reading does. It allows us to really, just in these 2 lines, we see that there's a lot to unpack. The next line begins with Roderick continuing to speak, and he's speaking to either both or just Rosina. We're not really certain because we can't see it, but maybe both of them know him well enough to understand that what he's saying is that in his former sad experience, as you know, has gifted me with some degree of insight into the gloomy mysteries of the human heart. And you would think that that would be enough for one sentence, but we're dealing with an age in which the science of writing isn't quite as, I would say, matched up or paired with our understanding of how people speak and the breath that they need to say one group of words. So in the modern age, we tend to put a period to where we start to run out of breath when we're trying to speak, and that matches what we think. In this day and age, they use commas, they take a breath, and then they continue to write. And so the sentences can become very long, and that's part of what happens when you're doing close reading, is that you will notice these types of things as you're reading. This is called syntax. It's the arrangement of language. Back to the interpretation, he's saying that he has been exposed to a sad experience, which in our age we would maybe interpret as a form of depression. He's saying that it gives him the authority or the credibility to speak about the topic of depression. Now, I'm calling it depression because we know about psychology, but you're not going to see the word depression in this passage. So he's calling it gloomy mysteries of the human heart, a sad experience. These are indicators that we're dealing with a depressive state. And he's saying that through which I have wandered like one astray in a dark cavern. This is metaphorical language. Again, a dark cavern and astray sort of gives us a time dimension to it. So as we continue our interpretation, we see that he has had a sad experience. Others know about it. It gives him credibility to speak about depression. One astray would mean that you are dealing with something that was not momentary. You've been experiencing for a while, and that's what we know about depression in the modern age. We know that it can last for a substantial period of time. And he adds to the notion with more metaphorical language that the depression is strong. So what the phrase is saying is that his torch is fast flickering to extinction. So our interpretation is that there's kind of a hopeless sense to the experience of depression. And then we get a shift. We have our period here, right here, which ends that thought. And then he says, but. So we know that's a transitional word that prepares our mind for a different type of thought that is more than likely going to contrast the previous thought. But this man, this class of men, is a hopeless puzzle. So what he's saying here is that he has tried to write about someone who doesn't quite fit the mold of the depressive episodes that he has experienced. The next line is responding dialogue, and what will happen is our minds will see the word sculptor in a close reading, whereas if we're reading quickly, we will simply see the quotations and then we will know that it was spoken by the sculptor. But when we're close reading, we can see the word sculptor before we even say the words. And so that's kind of what close reading does. It allows us really to look at a text with a sort of microscopic effect, to where we're seeing things out of sequence and we're knowing information in advance, as opposed to the flow of reading. What the sculptor here is saying is that he wants to know what he's writing about without actually reading the manuscript. He's saying, well, but propound him. So now again we're experiencing language that is antiquated. No one asks others to propound people anymore. And he continues by saying, let's have an idea of a hint at least. So that means that he is willing potentially to read what Roderick has written, but he wants sort of a preparatory oration as to what it is that he has been writing about. He wants an idea of what he's going to be reading about before he begins reading, and that's not unquestionable or unreasonable to ask. And Roderick is happy to oblige. He says, "Why indeed?" replied Roderick. So Roderick at this point is speaking to the sculptor, but we know that Rosina is next to the sculptor, so he's addressing the sculptor's question, but he's still in essence speaking to both Rosina and the sculptor. They're sitting there with him. And what he's saying is, he's launching into his description of the hopeless puzzle that he wants to describe. And because we have the language being used of a sculptor by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne pairs this picture of this imagery of a sculptor with the carving of marble, and that is part of the magic of Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing and part of what we understand as literature, I guess you could say. There's always questions about what literature really is, but we do know that the intensive use of metaphorical speech is part of what we consider good literature, great literature, historic literature. People that know how to speak in terms of metaphor are really prone to being great writers. And so what Roderick is saying is the person is someone who could be carved out of marble, and some yet unrealized perfection of human science to endow with an exquisite mockery of intellect. This right here is complicated language, and if we put the two together, we understand these metaphors to mean that when you carve something out of marble and we think of a human being, generally what comes to mind, or what could come to mind in this day and age, would be the statue of David, because there's a lot of literature that comes from what's known as the Augustan Age. The Augustan Age refers to ancient Rome, And so what we're thinking of here, carved out of marble, is that a being that could be carved out of marble is someone who is near perfection. And he even uses the word perfection when we speak of his intellect. So a mockery of intellect would be like someone who is infinitely more smarter than others. He is so smart that he is an exquisite mockery of intellect. Then we have the contrastive word but. This is transitional. It moves us in to a different kind of thinking that is in opposition to what was previously said. But still there lacks the last inestimable touch of a divine creator. So he's saying that even though this person conceivably looks perfect and he's incredibly smart, there's something wrong with him that is uncanny. That's in essence what's being said with this complex language that Nathaniel Hawthorne is using. He goes on to describe the hopeless puzzle as someone who looks like a man. So this person is the semblance of a man. He's saying that there's an element of deception involved. And he even goes so far as to say that he looks, and perchance, like a better specimen of man than you ordinarily meet. So this is the element of deception. And so what's being said here is that we can see someone who looks like they are perfectly normal and even someone who's potentially admirable, but there's something wrong underneath. So the overall gist of these phrases are that someone is deceptive in their looks because they look and speak and act like they're perfectly normal and even upstanding, but there's something wrong underneath. There's something wrong underneath that can be sensed by certain kinds of human beings, potentially people who have experienced gloomy mysteries of the human heart. He goes on with his description. You might esteem him wise. He is capable of cultivation and refinement and has at least an external conscience. So here he has explained his own metaphors in kind of the ways that I have described him, only he uses terse language to state that the person is potentially upstanding. He's refined, he's knowledgeable, he's cultured, and he appears to have a sense of morality. Then we have the word but again, which is leading us in another direction, a contrastive direction. The demands that spirit makes upon spirit are precisely those to which he cannot respond. When at last you come close to him, you find him chill and unsubstantial, a mere vapor. So there's something inhuman about him. I believe, said Rosina. So now the person who is Rosina is participating in the conversation, that she has a glimmering idea of what he means. So after all that he's been saying in this language, we've dissected it to where we can fairly understand what it is that's being said. But since this is an actual setting where people aren't dissecting each other's words, the idea that Rosina has is only glimmering. She doesn't have a full picture. It's just a sort of an impression of what Roderick is trying to say. But we see that because she does have a glimmering idea of what he's saying, we see that he is able to explain himself in a way that is allowing his message to get through to the both of them, well, to Rosina at least. He's explained it on the request of the sculptor, and Rosina is inserting her voice to state that she's getting the impression, and she may or may not be speaking for the sculptor as well. That's left to the imagination, as we can see upon close reading that the sculptor hasn't spoken again. That's what close reading does. It allows us to see things in advance of the narrative. Then be thankful, answered her husband. So at this point, and he's smiling. So at this point, Rosina and Roderick, we have to assume, are married. This is a married couple sitting with a sculptor in the summer house. But here we go with the alternative frame of mind, a contrastive state of mind. He's saying, do not anticipate any further illumination from what I am about to read. So he's saying, don't gather any more imagery from this narrative that he's going to recite for them. This is a kind of a confusing statement to make because we don't use the word illumination anymore. So in order to really make sense of what he's asking her to do, we have to finish the passage. And what he's saying is, I have here imagined such a man to be what probably he never is, conscious of the deficiency in his spiritual organization. So he's saying he's imagining that whoever it is that he's describing is in a fictive sort of way aware that he comes off as unhuman, chill, and unsubstantial, but what he probably never is in real life is that he's never aware that to others he comes off as chill, unsubstantial. So this is a fictive device in which the person is becoming or has become or is somehow aware of the fact that he's chill and unsubstantial, a mere vapor. Methinks, here's more antiquated language that tells us we are dealing with antiquated literature. Methinks the result would be a sense of cold unreality wherewith he would go shivering through the world, longing to exchange his load of ice for any burden of real grief that fate could fling upon a human being. Here is he's creating conjecture, a hypothesis that if he were to encounter this personage who glides past him occasionally in life, if this person were in fact conscious of the deficiency in his spiritual organization, the result of that conscious sort of awareness of this defect of character, I guess you could call it, the result would be that he would react to it, that he would want to somehow get rid of it. He would long to exchange it. So this is a hypothetical idea that in real life may or may not happen. The last sentence of the passage is a staged direction in which Roderick begins to read. The line reads, contenting himself with this preface, Roderick began to read. So I use the term abstract. Nathaniel Hawthorne uses the word preface. And that word is actually more appropriate because the term abstract is a preface to academic writing. A preface would be something that you would put maybe in academic writing, but you would use it more normally in a piece of fiction. What we have in the end is an opening passage, a preface, if you will, though this is not the author's preface, this is a fictive device. What we have, in the case of this being a fairly speedy close reading, is that we have three characters, Roderick, Rosina, and the sculptor. They are sitting in a summer house. Roderick has written about someone that comes to mind that is important to him because he feels like it's someone who needs to be written about. And this person is described as chill and unsubstantial. So this is actually in and of itself a set of words that really needs to be unpacked. You could probably write an entire doctoral thesis on what it means to be chill and unsubstantial. The overall passage, in light of this reading and in light of the separation between it and the following text, tells us that this is a frame narration and that what we are about to read is the work of Roderick, and it does not pertain to the summer house, and it does not pertain to the scene in which Roderick is sitting with a sculptor and his wife.